Is this how you imagined finding your neighbor? No. I stopped imagining after that. The first thing Daniel noticed was the silence, and silence, he would later realize, is never really nothing. It is always the sound of something that has stopped. He stood on the frostbitten porch of the small blue house next to his own, keys jingling uselessly in his pocket because he had no key to that door, only a growing, cold certainty in his chest that something was deeply wrong. The newspaper from 3 days ago was still lying on the welcome mat, soaked through and curling at the edges from a rain that had passed a night earlier. The porch light, which always clicked off automatically at dawn, was still burning weakly against the gray morning sky. And through the narrow gap in the curtains of the front window, he could see a shape on the floor that his mind refused, for 3 or 4 unbearable seconds, to recognize as a person. He would ask himself later, over and over, in the weeks that followed, what he had imagined he might find when he finally worked up the courage to knock on Eleanor Voss's door that morning. Had he imagined she was simply unwell, resting, perhaps annoyed at being disturbed? Had he imagined an ordinary excuse, a broken phone, a forgotten errand, some small and forgivable explanation that would let him walk back to his own house and exhale? But the truth was he had not really imagined anything at all, because for almost a year, Daniel had trained himself not to imagine anything about Eleanor Voss. He had trained himself not to think about her at all. And that, more than anything else, was the story he needed to tell, because it was the story of how a man can live 3 feet from another human being and let an entire year pass without truly seeing her, until the morning he found her on the floor of her living room, and understood, with a violence that knocked the breath out of him, exactly what his silence had cost. If this story of kindness and second chances is already tightening something in your chest, I want to ask you for something small before we go further. Hit like on this video, leave a comment with one word that describes how this story is making you feel, share it with someone who might need a reminder that it is never too late to knock on a door, and if you have not already, subscribe to this channel, because we tell these stories every single week for people who still believe that ordinary people can change each other's lives. Now let's go back to where it started, almost exactly 1 year before that terrible, transformative morning. Daniel Marsh had moved into the house on Larkspur Lane 4 years earlier, back when his wife Claire was still alive, back when the house still smelled like her rosemary bread on Sunday mornings and her laughter still bounced off the kitchen walls loud enough that Eleanor, then in her early 70s and full of an energy that seemed to defy her age, used to lean over the low fence between their yards and shout across that she could hear them being happy, and it made her whole week. Eleanor had been a widow for a decade by then, her husband Walter having passed from a heart attack while gardening, of all the ordinary and heartbreaking ways for a life to end, and she had built for herself in that decade a small, stubborn independence that she wore like armor. She grew tomatoes that were, by every account, the best on the street. She fed the neighborhood cats whether the neighborhood wanted them fed or not. She remembered birthdays, brought over soup when anyone was sick, and had a laugh that carried down the block like a bell being rung. Claire and Eleanor had become close in a way that surprised Daniel at first, an 80-year age gap doing nothing to slow the friendship between them. They would sit on Eleanor's porch in the evenings with mugs of tea, Claire asking Eleanor about her life, about Walter, about the war her father had fought in, and Eleanor asking Claire when she and Daniel planned on filling their house with children, a question Claire always answered with a soft, knowing smile that made Daniel's chest ache to remember later, because he had not understood, in that moment, that the answer to that question had already quietly become complicated in ways his wife had not yet told him. Claire was diagnosed 8 months after they moved in. The word that came back from the doctors was one of those words that rearranges a person's entire understanding of time, compressing years into months, and months into a countdown that both of them tried, with increasing desperation, not to look directly at. Eleanor was there through nearly all of it. She was the one who sat with Claire during chemotherapy when Daniel could not get away from the hospital where he worked as an emergency room nurse, the terrible irony of spending his shifts saving strangers while his own wife's body dismantled itself never lost on him. She was the one who brought food that neither of them had the strength to cook. She sat holding Claire's hand during the final weeks with a steadiness that Daniel, wrecked and hollowed by grief even before the grief had fully arrived, could not manage to hold himself. When Claire died, something in Daniel died with her that never came back the same way. He went through the funeral like a man operating a machine from somewhere far outside his own body. Eleanor was there, of course, standing beside him at the graveside in a black coat 2 sizes too large for her thin frame, gripping his hand so hard it left marks, whispering to him that grief does not end but it does eventually learn to sit quietly instead of screaming. He had nodded, and thanked her, and for a few months after the funeral, she had continued coming by, bringing food he barely touched, sitting with him on the porch in a silence that used to feel like company. But somewhere in the year that followed, grief did something to Daniel that he was ashamed of and never spoke about to anyone. It did not just take Claire from him. It took his ability to be around anything that reminded him of her, and Eleanor, who had loved his wife so completely, who had sat by her bed and held her hand while she died, became unbearable to look at, not because Daniel blamed her for anything, but because every line on her face, every cup of tea she offered, every story about Claire she gently tried to share, reopened a wound that Daniel had convinced himself he could only survive by keeping permanently closed. So he stopped answering the door. He stopped waving from the driveway. He took to leaving for work before Eleanor's porch light came on and coming home after dark, timing his life around the avoidance of an 81-year-old woman whose only crime had been loving his wife as much as he had. He told himself this was survival. He told himself Eleanor would understand, that she had lived long enough to know grief takes strange shapes, that she of all people, having buried a husband herself, would forgive a widower his cowardice. And for a long stretch of that year, this lie held together well enough to let him keep functioning, keep going to work, keep existing inside the husk of the life he had left. It was only in the quiet hours, lying awake in a bed that still smelled faintly of a shampoo he could not bring himself to throw away, that the shame crept in, the recognition that somewhere behind the wall he had built, a lonely old woman was still living her life 3 feet from his, and he had made the choice, every single day for nearly a year, to let her live it without him. He noticed things, of course, the way people notice things they have decided not to think about. He noticed her garden, once so meticulously kept, growing wilder and more overgrown as the months passed, weeds choking out the tomato plants that used to win compliments from every neighbor on the street. He noticed that her porch light seemed to stay on longer into the mornings, as if she had begun forgetting to turn it off, or perhaps had begun needing it lit for longer because sleep no longer came as easily. He noticed, though he refused to let himself dwell on it, that the visits from her daughter, who lived 3 states away and came perhaps twice a year, had stopped coming at all sometime in the last several months, though he could not have said exactly when, because noticing would have required looking, and looking was the one thing he had promised himself he would not do. The morning everything changed began like any other. Daniel had a late shift that day and was leaving the house closer to 9 than his usual 6, moving quickly toward his car with his head down out of habit, when something made him stop. It was not a sound, because there was no sound, and that itself was what stopped him. Larkspur Lane in the mornings usually carried at least the small ambient noise of Eleanor's radio playing through her open kitchen window, an old habit of hers, tuning into the classical station while she made her coffee, the volume just loud enough to drift across the yard. That morning there was nothing. No radio. No sound of a kettle. No sight of her at the window where she usually stood watering the small pots of herbs on her sill. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he had a shift to get to. He got as far as his car door before the newspaper on her porch, 3 days deep, caught his eye properly for the first time, and the porch light burning uselessly against the gray daylight, and something in him, some old instinct from years of emergency room work that recognized the shape of wrongness even before his conscious mind could name it, turned him around and walked him across the frost-covered grass toward her door. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked harder, calling her name, his voice sounding strange and thin in the cold morning air, a name he had not spoken aloud in the better part of a year. Nothing answered him but the silence, and it was that silence, finally, that broke through everything he had built to keep himself from feeling. He went to the front window, cupped his hands against the glass, and looked through the gap in the curtains, and there, on the floor of her living room, half covered by a fallen side table and a shattered lamp, lay Eleanor Voss, motionless, one arm bent beneath her at an angle that made his stomach turn to ice. What happened next came from a part of Daniel that had not switched off even in a year of grief and avoidance, the part trained by a decade of emergency medicine to move before thought, to act before fear could take hold. He broke the small side window with his elbow, wrapped in his jacket sleeve, reached through and unlatched the door, and was across her living room in seconds, on his knees beside her, 2 fingers pressed to her throat, praying with something more desperate than words that he would find a pulse. He found one, weak and irregular, but there, and it was in that moment, feeling the faint stubborn rhythm of a life still fighting to continue, that Daniel understood with total clarity how close he had come to losing something he had spent a year pretending he did not need. He called for an ambulance with the steady, practiced voice of a man who had made 1,000 such calls in his professional life, but his hands shook the entire time. Eleanor had been down for at least several hours, likely since the previous evening, having apparently suffered a fall that fractured her hip and left her unable to reach the phone on the side table she had knocked over in the process. She was severely dehydrated, in shock, her body temperature dangerously low from a night spent on the cold hardwood floor of a house she lived in entirely alone. The paramedics later told Daniel, with the blunt honesty of people who deal daily in the fragile margins between life and death, that another few hours, maybe less, would likely have been the difference between finding her and burying her. The hospital corridor where Daniel waited that first night was one he had walked 1,000 times in his professional capacity, but he had never experienced it from this side, as the person pacing rather than the person working. He sat in a plastic chair outside the room where Eleanor was being treated, still in his work clothes, hands still faintly trembling, and allowed himself, for the first time in nearly a year, to simply feel the full weight of everything he had been avoiding. He thought about Claire's hand in Eleanor's during those final weeks. He thought about the soup Eleanor used to bring, still warm, wrapped carefully in a dish towel to keep the heat in during the walk across the yard. He thought about the tomato plants going to seed in an untended garden, about a porch light burning through daylight hours because an old woman had begun to forget, and he understood, sitting in that hallway, that his grief had cost him more than his own healing. It had very nearly cost Eleanor her life. She woke 2 days later, frail and disoriented but alive, and when her eyes found Daniel sitting beside her hospital bed, the first thing she did, before asking about her hip, before asking how long she had been there, before asking anything about herself at all, was reach for his hand and tell him, in a voice cracked from disuse, that she had wondered every single day whether he was eating properly. It was such an absurd, generous, entirely Eleanor thing to say, worrying about his meals while lying in a hospital bed with a fractured hip, that something in Daniel finally broke open completely, and he wept beside her bed in a way he had not allowed himself to weep even at Claire's funeral, the sobs coming up from somewhere so deep it frightened him, and Eleanor, weak as she was, simply held his hand and let him. He told her everything in that hospital room over the following days, the avoidance, the shame, the year of silence, the way her presence had become unbearable not because of anything she had done but because of everything she represented, every memory of Claire that he had not been strong enough to face. He expected, perhaps even deserved, her anger. Instead Eleanor told him something that stayed with him for the rest of his life, that grief is not a debt owed to the dead, but the dead do not want their memory spent building walls around the living, that Claire had loved him too much to want him disappearing into a house alone, and that if there was one thing 81 years had taught her about love, it was that the people we lose would rather we stumbled forward, clumsily and imperfectly, than stood perfectly still out of fear of forgetting them. Eleanor's recovery took months, and Daniel, for the first time in a year, showed up. He drove her to physical therapy appointments on his days off. He learned to cook the soups she used to bring him, badly at first, then less badly, delivering them to her hospital room and later to the rehabilitation facility in dishes he had bought specifically to replicate the ones she always used. He called her daughter, the one who lived 3 states away, not to accuse her of absence but simply to let her know her mother was recovering and would love to hear from her more often, a conversation that opened a door between mother and daughter that had quietly been closing for years. He weeded the garden himself one Saturday, badly, uprooting 2 tomato plants he mistook for weeds, a mistake Eleanor laughed about for weeks afterward from her recliner, laughing in a way that made the whole house feel less empty. By the time Eleanor was strong enough to return home, something had shifted permanently between them, and between Daniel and the life he had been merely surviving rather than living. He found himself, without quite planning it, spending evenings on her porch again, the way Claire once had, mugs of tea between them, Eleanor telling him stories about Walter, about her own younger years, about a version of grief she had walked through decades before he had, and had come out the other side of not unscarred but not consumed either. He found himself laughing again, small and rusty at first, the way a joint moves after a long stillness, but real. He began sleeping better. He began, cautiously, letting himself imagine a future again, not one that erased Claire, but one that made room for more than just her absence. He came to understand, in the months that followed, that the morning he found Eleanor on that floor had not simply been a rescue. It had been a second chance disguised as a catastrophe, a brutal, narrow window through which he had been given the opportunity to become, again, the kind of man capable of showing up for another person. He thought often about how differently that morning could have gone, how easily he might have gotten into his car without stopping, the silence registering only as a vague unease he drove away from instead of walked toward. He thought about how thin the margin had been between the life he was living and the loss he so narrowly avoided, and it changed, permanently, the way he moved through the world, the way he noticed the people around him, the way he refused, from that point forward, to let silence from a neighbor's house go unquestioned. If this story has moved something in you, if it has reminded you of someone you have been meaning to check on, a neighbor, a friend, a family member you have let silence grow between, I want to ask you gently to reach out to them today, and I want to ask you to show this story some love here too. Like this video if you believe people deserve second chances even after they have failed each other. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to knock on a door. And subscribe to this channel if these stories of kindness and quiet redemption mean something to you, because we will keep telling them. And before we close this story, I want to ask you for one more small thing. Somewhere in your life, there is a name of a person, a neighbor, a friend, someone who has gone quiet, who you have been meaning to check on. I want you to type their name, or simply the word hope, in the comments below, right now, as a small promise to yourself that you will not let another year of silence pass the way Daniel almost did. Eleanor Voss lived 4 more years after that morning, years that Daniel would later describe as the richest of his adult life outside of his marriage, years filled with Sunday dinners and mended fences, both literal and otherwise, years in which the tomato garden flourished again under both their hands, years in which Daniel slowly, carefully, allowed himself to build a life that honored Claire's memory instead of hiding from it. When Eleanor finally passed, peacefully, in her sleep, in the very house where Daniel had once found her fighting for her life on the floor, he was the one who found her again, but this time there was no horror in it, only a quiet, aching gratitude for every one of the years he had almost let slip away unlived. At her funeral, when someone asked him how he had known to check on her that particular morning, after a year of silence, Daniel found himself unable to answer with anything except the truth, that some part of him had simply refused, on that one morning, to keep pretending he did not still love her, and that refusal, small and reluctant as it was, had been enough to save them both.